Hello everyone, we're now into Unit 6. We're going to be looking today at the Nazi police state and specifically the use of the SS and Gestapo in exercising control over Germany. These two images here are images that we often associate with the SS and the Gestapo. We often associate the Gestapo with stopping people, frisking them, searching them, trying to find out who was German and who was not. And we often associate the SS with very violent acts of crime and murder throughout the Second World War. But we're going to look at a slightly different side to the police state, mainly in the way in which Hitler was going to organize the police state to exact control over the government and over his population. We've got four key terms. We're looking at police states. This is a society where the government controls the citizens by using the police without cause or without trial. Another way of looking at this is martial law, where essentially the military is running the country. The SS was Hitler's private bodyguards. Eventually, they became that larger army group. The Gestapo is short for the Geheimstaatspolice, which is a secret state police force. And the rule of law is a situation where a country uses the police, the courts, and the law all fairly for the citizens of that country. The police state itself, the Nazis decided to use force and terror to keep their population in line. Hitler and the Nazis needed everybody to follow their rules to make sure that they would remain powerful in Germany. And in doing so, they needed to make sure that people had enough fear to avoid disobeying those new rules and laws. Now, if they could not bully someone into following those instructions, they would terrorize them. And a group that was notably terrorized would be the Jews living in Germany. The police state included the SS and the Gestapo, and fear again kept people in line. In the backs of everybody's mind before they did something, they would question to themselves, is this something that the Gestapo or the SS will find out? And if they do find out, will I get into trouble? Now, the police state itself, they extended control to all aspects of life. Now, the legal system was under Nazi control, and judges who might not uphold Nazi values were either dismissed from their jobs or they were sent away, oftentimes to a concentration camp. Now, if Hitler did not agree with the sentencing within a court, he had the power to overturn their decision. And that does a lot to show that the judges don't actually have as much control within the legal system as they perhaps should. Now, starting in 1933, opponents of the Nazi regime were placed in detention centers. And by 1935, this is when concentration camps were opened, and that's where these political opponents would be placed. We can see on the right-hand side, the SS, this was led by Heinrich Himmler. They were the most important organization and they oversaw the Gestapo and the SD, which was the secret intelligence agency. So here's a little bit more detail about that hierarchy. So the SS is led by Himmler. They were initially set up to be bodyguards for Hitler, but they were fiercely loyal. The SS soldiers were the most elite within the German army. Now, the Gestapo was that secret police force that we alluded to a few moments ago. They monitored the German population looking for signs of opposition or any kind of resistance that could get in the way of the Nazis spreading their ideals. They were most often helped by just regular German people who were informing on their fellow citizens. And we can really relate this back to what was going on in the USA in the 1950s during McCarthyism, where most people were very willing to tell on their neighbors, if you will, to try to get them into trouble if they were doing something wrong, or just to throw suspicion off of oneself, just to try to make sure you're a little bit safer within that political system. And the SD, this was the intelligence gathering agency of the SS. They were responsible for the security of Hitler. They were led by Reinhard Heydrich. He was a top SS guy. He was in charge of Czechoslovakia in the 1940s. Now, the police state needed the Enabling Act to really function. And just a reminder, that Enabling Act allowed Hitler to pass laws without the consultation and permission of the Reichstag. It was really important for the Nazis to be able to pass the laws that they wanted to without any opposition. Now, the Enabling Act allowed the Nazis to gain control of the political system at the central level, so that's nationally, so that's kind of like our parliament, really, and at the regional level, so that would be like our mayor. The Enabling Act also gave Hitler the power to use his police forces in whichever manner he chose, and Jewish families could be placed under surveillance. And if they were found to be breaking any laws or any rules or undesirable, they could then be sent away. Now, German families would have noticed that their Jewish neighbors were disappearing, but not everyone actually tried to help. This again is going back to the fear of the Gestapo is outweighing the desire to do the right thing. And if you notice that some of your neighbors were going missing, maybe neighbors of the same belief system, you would know that something's not quite right here because only this particular group of people are being sent away. Now, if you were afraid of your government, you probably wouldn't speak out, rather keeping yourself safe. And that's how people would react knowing the Gestapo would potentially be listening to them.
One of the reasons the Nazi regime was so successful within Germany was because of the support of specialized groups. The Nazis also altered and manipulated the legal system to their own ends. This chapter looks at what were known as the SS, short for a German word that meant protection squad, as well as the Gestapo, or secret police. The SS wore black shirts and were led by Heinrich Himmler. They began life as the elite bodyguards for Adolf Hitler in the 1920s, eventually being in control of the entire German police force in the 1930s. A key role was played by the SS in establishing Nazi concentration camps, to which enemies of the state were sent. These included Jews, gypsies, criminals, homosexuals, prostitutes and tramps, as well as Marxists and other political opponents. It's estimated that the SS enslaved, tortured and killed around 12 million people in total. Whilst the SA, a semi-independent force who swore an oath of allegiance to Hitler, was always seen as a potential threat to the leadership of the Nazi regime, the SS was considered completely loyal. No event similar to the Night of the Long Knives, where many of the SA were killed, was needed to reassure Hitler about the SS. The SS had, in fact, begun life as a division of the SA, but grew dramatically in power and number as the Nazis gained more and more power. In 1923, they numbered just 280. 10 years later, they were almost 1,000 times stronger. The SS took control of the Gestapo in the mid-1930s. The Gestapo were the official state secret police, whose job it was to find out information about enemies of the state. Nazi propaganda, as well as rumour and gossip, made German people think that the Gestapo were around every corner, listening to everything they said. Friends and families voluntarily gave testimonies against each other, scared they might appear disloyal to the Nazi German state if they didn't report everything they found, even slightly suspicious. Recent research by historians has shown that, in fact, most German towns and cities had no more than 50 Gestapo agents at any one time. Their secret methods and reputation were more effective than their numbers would suggest. Most of the Gestapo's time was spent going through reports of ordinary German people who had made accusations against each other within their community and separating fact from fiction. Perhaps the most subtle and yet most powerful way of keeping the German people within their control was the changes the Nazis made to the criminal justice system. The civil liberties granted by the Weimar Constitution in the 1920s vanished under the Nazis. Lawyers were compelled to become members of the Nazi Lawyers Association. Instead of state prosecutors being held to a uniform system of punishments fitting the crime, they were free to punish individuals any way they saw fit. The role of the Defense Counsel, which is extremely important if defendants are to receive a fair trial, was severely weakened. All this made it very difficult for any individual or group to even consider opposing the Nazi regime. Whilst in 1932 the death penalty was the statutory punishment for only 3 crimes, after 1933 it was put in place for 46. In addition, the Nazis stopped releasing prisoners once they'd completed their sentences, instead transferring them to concentration camps. The harshness of the Nazi regime led to a massive decline in theft, muggings and murder. This was welcomed by the German middle class, who believed it to be a return to some form of stability after the Great Depression of the early 1930s. They believed Hitler when he stated that antisocial elements and deviants had been treated severely in order for Germany to once again become great.
So overall, a summary of the police state. So if we look at the before and the after is a great way just to look at this visually. So before the police state, judges were independent. They could essentially rule the way that they saw fit, using the law to the best of their ability. And after the Nazis made judges swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler and act in the national interest of the Nazi government. If they did not do so, they would be dismissed from their job. And this was not just exclusive to judges. Teachers had to join what was known as the Nazi Teachers League, and they had to teach Nazi values to their students. 97% of teachers swore an oath to this league and joined. 3% decided, this isn't for me, I'm going to leave my job rather than do something that I don't believe in. Before the police state, lawyers were free to belong to any associations they wished to join. And after lawyers, they had to join the Nazi Lawyers Association. I'm seeing a little bit of a trend here. And Nazis had oversight and control over them as well. Defense lawyers, beforehand, they were awarded equal rights as prosecution lawyers. Afterwards, they had fewer rights. It was more difficult to defend somebody who was accused of a crime. And this is feeding into the whole fear of the Gestapo and fear of the political system. If I do something wrong, even if I'm innocent or if I'm not guilty, it's going to be very difficult for me to prove my innocence. And lastly, before the police state, there were standard punishments for different crimes, which meant people were punished the same across the entire country for the same crime. Afterwards, local prosecutors had a little bit more decision in terms of what kind of sentences could be handed out. So it wasn't as equal and uniform across all of Germany in terms of sentences being handed out for crimes. Okay, now time for our bonus facts. The Gestapo recruited a lot of really talented researchers, and I said we'd come back to this image. And this is what we often think about with the Gestapo, their secret police, they're investigating people, they're spying on them. And that was a portion of what the Gestapo did, but a significant portion was just about going through paperwork. Uh, you would have a lot of people playing the blame game in Germany, saying that somebody's guilty of a crime, and then they're pointing the finger back at those people, saying, no, they're liars, they're actually guilty. And Gestapo officers, like this man on the right hand side, he would spend much of his time simply going through reports and paperwork and trying to separate fact from fiction to figure out what was really going on, who was really guilty, or is this just a case of people trying to have a feud over, maybe a land dispute or an argument they had last week. The Gestapo had a really long wanted list. This is a picture of a woman named Nancy Wake. So, very famously, she was a spy during the Second World War, and she always wore red lipstick. Now, she was born in New Zealand, but she grew up and had grew up in France and had a French husband, so she spoke fluent French. She was on the Gestapo's most wanted list because she was a secret operative who was working to eliminate SS officers. And the last one is the idea of the Gestapo was perhaps more powerful than the Gestapo actually was themselves. They only had at any one time about 16,000 members who were fully employed by the Gestapo. And that's monitoring a population of over 66 million people. So if you do the maths, that's really not a lot of Gestapo officers for that size of a population. For example, the city of Dusseldorf, it had a population of 500,000 people, but at any one time there were no more than 120 Gestapo officers in that city. Some very small towns or villages might only have one officer just stop by for a very short period of time. But it was the sense that the Gestapo was everywhere, and the idea of that Gestapo was far more powerful than perhaps they were themselves. Okay, that finishes our lesson today on the police state. Please have a look on Show My Homework to complete the quiz, and just double check any other tasks that your teacher has set for you.